Mostly next up from the University of Mainz.
All right. Here you see a bunch of flamingos forming a population, and this is not AI generated. This is kind of like a real photo. And I realized that I didn't quite forget to put the photographer's name here because I think it's nice to give people credit. I had the thought in my head when I was walking back towards the hotel this morning because, you know, jet lag, one is up early and all that. But then I bumped into Andy, who convinced me that I need caffeine. So for the photographer gets no credit because I can't remember who it was. But yeah, you can see why I chose this photo here, because these are individual flamingos here, and they form some sort of collective. And people often use the word population fitness without really defining what they mean. And all these talks this morning, they have been very nicely defining what they mean when they talk about a term. And I'm instead going to present all kinds of cases where, kind of like case studies, that have just convinced me that it's really a really hard and slippery concept to even define. So let's see how this goes and what sort of feedback I get from there. But also think about the workshop that we are here for. I think the title has some sort of internal conflict angle, which means that we should probably mostly be talking about sort of genomes and organisms and this sort of interaction here. And I could have talked about something that Tom, who is sitting here, and Arvid, where's Arvid? There. We actually have a paper submitted where we do very much talk about something quite exciting, what happens at these levels. However, Tom is going to give a research talk about that tomorrow, so it would be a bit odd if I talked about that now. So instead, I'm going to move up one level and talk about what is selected for at the organism level and how the populations, some sort of concept of population fitness might react to that. And depending on who you talk to, there are people who just don't quite see why there should ever be any conflict between these levels. And for example, if you talk to microbiologists who study evolutionary rescue, here's a famous paper about that. And you can see that, well, what happens in this particular experiment is that there's yeast cells, and then you start throwing salt on them. And if you have ever been baking, you know that they tolerate some level of salt. But if there's too much, then the population is declining until they get some sort of mutations going on in there. And then there's what's good for the individual yeast cells is also clearly good for the population, that it can grow. And population growth is actually very often used as a proxy for population fitness. So this then comes up quite soon in the theory. And by this, I mean Ronald Fisher, not necessarily my own paper about that, but I was thinking about the population fitness concept a while ago when I wrote this kind of like an essay style review about the topic. But there is a sense in which fitness keeps improving, and we have heard Fisher's the fundamental theorem of natural selection. It was already being mentioned this morning. So when something is all the time increasing, what do we actually mean by, what is this concept W that is actually increasing there? Natural selection increases fitness at a rate equal to the, it makes me feel like I should click here. It's actually not visible on my screen, so let's see if it goes away. At a rate equal to the additive genetic variance in fitness. So if you just accept this, then something is always increasing. And if you do experiments on this, then I'm going to sort of pick on these people a little bit here, and that's only because I'm so envious of the amazing work that they do there. You probably have all heard about the long-term evolution experiment, where what's happening is that these microbes are being transferred every so often to fresh medium, so therefore population growth can always be happening, and they just keep getting better at growing in this somewhat artificial environment. Exactly how much better, this is something that they do on the y-axis here. So this is just data from the first 50,000 generations. And you can see that on the y-axis, they have something cryptic, which is scaled fitness. And I'm going to look a bit in more detail what the scaled fitness actually is. But it starts at 1, and then you can see that by now, 50,000 generations later, there's something like a 70% improvement in there. What does this mean? And by the way, this just keeps going. So there's a paper from 2015 where they looked at the next, now they are at generation 60,000, and everything just sort of keeps still improving. And these are super famous studies, and they have taught us a lot about how evolution operates. But really what I'm thinking about here is not what sort of mutations these creatures achieve and what's going on, but what precisely is it what they plot on the y-axis. And this is the thing that is actually a little bit weird when you start looking at what they put in there. So in a way, it's not surprising that something can get better over evolutionary time, because that's what Fisher said. But then, if you think about it, and before I go to the sort of little mathematical problem that is here, just let's think about the conceptual problem that we have with equating fitness as population growth rate. So they have vastly improved fitness in just a few decades, which is 50,000 generations that can be achieved in a few decades if you're looking at bacteria. And they measure fitness fundamentally as there's some manipulation there, but it is a growth rate of microbes. So let's try to reconcile some facts here. Fitness keeps increasing. Fisher said that, and also the experiments say that. Fitness is measured as a population growth rate. And if you extrapolate backwards to something like the Triassic, just think about this. Bacteria existed back then, or also some, not everything that evolved since then existed, but sharks or birds or whatever, they were there. So how incredibly sluggish must they have been growing in order for these claims to be true, if we just sort of try to reconcile it? Or you could also extrapolate forwards, like in the future planetary scenarios, this incredible growth of absolutely everything that lives here. It's just absurd. So something must be, we must do a bit more work trying to understand what's going on in here. So, of course, this extrapolation into the future, that makes us think about something like the Darwinian demon, which I think this audience probably knows what it is, but if you don't know, it is a brainchild of George Williams. In this book, that I think the picture of this book also appeared this morning already. So it is an organism that has all the life history traits that you could potentially imagine are beneficial, and it has managed to maximize them all the way to absurdity. So it's an organism that matures immediately after birth, like not just in a nanosecond, but quicker than that. It survives forever, and it has infinite fecundity. Well, George Williams in his book didn't actually show us a picture of this creature, so I just sort of made it up here. If this ever evolved, then of course in the next nanosecond, this lecture room would look like, oops, it went away. I think I keep pointing at there is the picture of what the world would look like. But of course, the world doesn't look like that, because at some point there will be some trade-offs. There's not enough carbon atoms in the universe to create a demon. So we know a priori that it cannot exist. But it does create a question of how should we then think about population fitness, and what is the conceptual interpretation of this data, but then also a bit of a sort of numerical problem in here that I only noticed because I was writing about the conceptual thing here. So is there something wrong with the data that they're producing? Well, methods-wise, there is actually this sort of little mathematical unsavoriness that I just mentioned here, because this is a tutorial, so you might as well know about it. But I should also emphasize that this is not really the point. I mean, even if they had produced a more sensible measure on the y-axis, they would have found this increase in there. And on the next slide, I will tell you, you can also read this paper, but I will tell you what they did in a sort of slightly funny way. But the real conceptual and biological message here is that they are actually not measuring absolute population growth, like how fast do the bacteria fill the world in some sort of absolute timescale units. Instead, what they do is how fast do the new types, the evolved types, outcompete the old types, which, because these are bacteria, you can put them in a freezer and you can sort of make the newly evolved types compete against their ancestors. And when both are present simultaneously, this is what they actually plot on the y-axis. And it's a very important difference that is important to keep in mind. But because this is, so normally I actually skip the next slide because it's a bit sort of annoying to nitpick about their y-axis. But because this is a tutorial, this is actually the first time that I'm presenting the problem also in slide format. What did they actually do? So this is a paper. This is not their main paper, but it's kind of like talking through the choices that they make on the y-axis. And they calculate fitness as a ratio of two logarithms. So this is kind of like how if strains A and B are competing against each other, and this is the initial density and this is the final density. So this is kind of some sort of a measure of growth rate, and the same thing for the B. And then they first take logs and then they divide. And this is a bit, when you take logs, then you have moved to an additive scale. So if you then start dividing things, some people are nodding here in shock, as you should. But just sort of showing what would happen if their experiments, I think they never noticed anything because in their experiments, everything still always grows. But if you had, for example, a situation where strain A doubles during the same time as B is halving, so it's really kind of like going away. So we have on the, so the first term we have to compute this is the doubling of the A, and then we compare that and divide by the halving of the B, and we try to figure out what is the value of this ratio. So this just translates to natural logarithm of 2. This one to 1/2, and then here's the rule that applies to logarithms. So we get this. The log of 1 is 0. So in the end, we have something like that, and the fitness of the winner is -1. So basically, it's a nonsensical measure. But because they probably always had kind of like large growth in their populations, they never noticed this. So the real issue here that we are talking about in population fitness is, what does it really mean? Kind of like, if we have 70% higher fitness, and let's assume that this is now the real number, because real fitness, when you put relative strain growth rates in there, you can get 70% also when you don't make these mathematical mistakes. So this is consistent with very many different interpretations of what might be going on in there. It could be that if you have started the competition with 10 to the power 6 cells each, that in the time that A doubles, now this is not now A and B, but there's A and the A prime, where the A prime is the evolved, sort of more advanced competitor strain. So maybe this one grows to that many cells, and then you get a 70%, like when you actually calculate it correctly, this is a 70% higher growth rate than the other. But it's also consistent with the fact that there could be complete non-growth in one of the strains, and the other one manages to go to 1.7. So that's also a 70% higher number at the end. Or it could be that one of them is declining, one of them is increasing. And here I've chosen the numbers such, they look like very specific numbers because they are the ones that keep the total population size exactly constant, but the difference is 70% in the end. So all of these things are possible. And this is also the solution to this whole Triassic paradox, as you could call it, because often evolution proceeds in such a way that the total population size doesn't change so much, but one type is replacing the other. So if you look at how the entire population has been growing, it hasn't actually been growing at all. So therefore, if you take population fitness to mean growth rates, it might stay completely unchanged during evolution. So does this mean that Fisher didn't understand something? Well, no, it doesn't mean that. It just means that you have to read Fisher quite carefully, because he has these, I guess given that this is a tutorial, I should actually explain what these terms mean. So here, W, as usual, it means fitness. And you can see that we are talking about mean fitness because there's the, what do you actually call this thing on top? Yeah. But these are all measured in different environments. So the prime means the evolved one, and without the prime, that is the ancestral one. And then the E can also be the ancestral environment or the evolved environment. And why does the environment evolve? Because this is now the environment created by the types that are there. So if, for example, the bacteria are having some sort of metabolic trait evolves that allows them to get more efficiently food out of the environment, then the ancestral type is going to starve. Whereas if the ancestral type was the only one present, then it probably managed to grow in there. So these are the kind of things that we are talking about there. So therefore, what Fisher was predicting to grow is not the whole equation. He was looking at this, which is kind of like almost like a common garden experiment. Like if the environment hasn't changed, how much better is the new type compared to the old type? And at least one person is nodding, so I'm happy. Whereas this is then what you're observing in terms of population growth. And this might not grow at all over evolution time because the environment becomes harder to keep being in. And by the way, a very long time ago, I didn't understand this. And in one manuscript, I wrote something silly. And there was a reviewer who corrected me and said that I should actually know how to read Fisher. And I've got this feeling that there's a non-zero probability that that reviewer is in this room. So you might as well out yourself. I did learn something during the process. So this is the way you should be interpreting things. So interestingly, in one of the papers from Lenski, in the long-term evolution experiments, the evolved cells actually do generally outnumber the ancestors at the end of a competition assay, but not when they're grown separately. So they kind of, this is happening in there. I don't know if they know how fundamentally important this is. So this whole thing that I've been talking about so far, we can't actually make any claim yet about what sort of fitness might actually get maximized when natural selection is acting on a population, when we talk about it as a sort of population level fitness. And one paper that I like quite a lot, depends a bit on sort of in which mathematical culture you grew up in, but if you're into the sort of adaptive dynamics and those kind of things, or what sort of fitness measure might get maximized, Milius and Diekmann, 96 is essential reading. So sometimes you get evolution maximizing R and sometimes lifetime reproductive success. And generally it depends, and you really need to understand the way density regulation operates on the population before you can decide what is the appropriate fitness measure. And you can always sort of do the calculation and then post hoc decide, okay, this seemed to be maximized if you're not sure. So as a whole, though, I get this feeling that depending a bit on who you talk to, like if you talk to the average microbiologist, and I think in this audience, there are some people who are not average microbiologists, but very often, they have this feeling that, there's no conflict really between the performance of individual cells and the performance of the collectives, unless they are into social behavior quite a bit. And this is maybe a clue that, when you get a lot of social behavior, that's when conflict starts raising its head. So I just sort of put the same slide here again about the evolutionary rescue of these yeast cells, because there are probably quite a lot of situations where, really what is good for individuals is good for population persistence or growth, or maybe the number of cells that you can reach when you are at carrying capacity. But this is definitely not true in those situations where, like we just had lunch, and I don't think anybody behaved this way, but if you do, and if food was a bit limiting, you can sort of see who ends up with a nice full belly and who does not. And one of my favorite examples that I like teaching to students is partial migration in birds and how that can exemplify a lot of the principles, what can happen when you're competing for finite resources within a species and population growth or fitness or persistence or whatever you call it doesn't necessarily get maximized. So migration is a trait that also can be sometimes very good both for individuals and for populations. So this is kind of like the yeast with salt again, where, depending on what sort of initial densities you have, and then you have salt or no salt, and whether the entire population survives is on the y-axis. And migration might sometimes be a bit like this as well. So if you have, for example, swallows, if they're trying to overwinter in, I've seen some pictures of Chicago in the winter, and if they try to do that here, probably that would be very bad for individuals, and it would also be very bad for their populations. But on the other hand, where I grew up, this is a goldcrest, which is a small European bird. It's actually Europe's smallest bird. And amazingly, it tries to overwinter in Finland, which seems a very silly idea. Some part of the population migrates and others try to overwinter, and many of them die. But some survive, and those that survive the winter, they are there at the very beginning of spring, so they can occupy the best territories. So this is the logic of the problem. So in general, when you are competing for something and you spend energy or time or whatever to outcompete your conspecifics, then you can end up in these situations where everybody ends up paying some sort of costs, but the total benefit, the total sort of size of the pie that you're slicing hasn't become bigger. And I'm sort of slightly deviating from, I will get back to the birds, but I just couldn't resist this because I know that you will be sitting in this audience there. And you're all quite happily sitting there, but if I was some sort of a rock star and you really wanted to get the best possible view, then it might be that you want to stand up. But then, of course, the third guy in this audience can't see anything, so then they have to stand up as well. And this process continues until almost everyone has to spend energy standing up the whole time. But on average, you don't actually get so much of a better view to what's here in the front. And this is something that game theory people who apply ideas to biology love to think about when it comes to the evolution of trees. Like here's a tropical forest from below. It's really dark in there. But if you look at the same thing from above, the fact that they are all standing up so tall, it doesn't mean that they are significantly closer to the sun. So it's just kind of putting a lot of effort into winning a zero-sum game, which is a bit silly. Or here's a plant biologist saying the same thing much more concisely. Plants are jerks. And the agricultural artificial selection has actually created crops that are much shorter because then they don't spend so much energy on this silly trying to outcompete each other. So what I'm claiming is that bird populations might be doing something a bit similar, but in this case that it's not really how tall the birds are, but their timing traits, when they want to come back from migration, or do they migrate at all? So a bird in its annual cycle, it has to go deal with all kinds of challenges. There's the weather, which is seasonal, but then you also want to get to nice places because that's, if you breed in a nice location, then that nice location might also have quite a bit of food for your chicks. So the benefit of migration, this is probably higher survival because otherwise it's hard to understand why you would do it at all. Of course, migration can be risky if you have to fly over that lake, for example. But you would imagine that trying to stay put is even riskier because weather will turn quite nasty at some point during the winter. But then if you have managed to overwinter successfully, which is a big if, then you get the best territories because they're all available, or at least some of them are still available because other individuals might also have the idea of overwintering and maybe surviving to be there. Therefore, the whole thing becomes frequency dependent. How much better your breeding success if you have survived and overwintered instead of migrating and trying to come back, that depends on others who are also making the same choice. And this is where I sort of turn into tutorial mode because I've got some lectures on this topic. And given that I was asked to, I still don't understand why I need to teach you kind of like how to solve an equation, but Nina is laughing, and maybe I can teach Nina to. We have known each other a long time, so she doesn't mind if I make jokes about this. So there will be an exam at the end, just specifically to Nina. So how do we actually get on with these equations and try to solve them? I'll just present the whole thing. So this can be done. So all we need to do is that first we have to calculate fitness in a population that has a certain proportion of migrants and the rest are trying to do the non-migrating strategy. And then you are trying to see if any other strategy, a different kind of X, can invade. And we need to assume something about the habitat. And this can be sort of done more generally than what I'm presenting here, but this is a sort of very simple assumption that let's say we can rank the territories from the best to the worst And there's a linear decline in territory quality as you go to the sort of lower ranking territories here. So that the very, very best one looks like this. There's a lot of food and everything is wonderful. And then the last one is like that, where breeding sort of doesn't succeed ever anymore. That's when the curve hits 0. So in general, you have your modeling assumptions there. We are trying to predict the evolutionary stable value of X based on the surviving over winter if you're migrating, which is SM, or if you're not migrating, which is SN. And like I said, there has to be kind of like one of them has to, the migrant strategy must have higher survival, otherwise you would never do that at all. And by the way, again, this is sort of tutorial mode. There's a certain sort of terminological choices that you have to make when you think about bird migration and residency, because ornithologists like to call resident, they might interpret that if you say resident strategy is something, then that means overwintering. But actually in the sort of maths literature about this topic, the opposite of a resident is a mutant. So the resident strategy is whatever the population was doing now, which might be, for example, everybody's migrating. So it doesn't mean staying resident. And there's, when you just become a modeler, you have to start to read all kinds of literature also to make the empirical interpretations of this. And to an ornithologist, by the way, I'll buy a beer if somebody knows who is this ornithologist. Nobody? This is James Bond. The James Bond, the fictional character, was named after the ornithologist because it's a cool name. James Bond might be saying that a resident is a bird that stays in a location year round. You just need to always define the terminology that you're using, whether you're an empiricist or a theoretician. This is one of the lessons here. So anyway, so we say non-migrant and migrant so that we can talk about resident and mutant in this framework. So the non-migrant birds, if they have survived, they get the best territories. And if there are this many such birds, so N as in number and subscript N as in non-migrant, then we have to figure out what is the average quality of the territories that they get, which is this. And now the linearity assumption is very easy here because it makes our lives easy because we are just taking the half of this and that. By the way, if this is the first territory, it should really be A minus B instead of just A. But if there's very many territories, it doesn't matter too much. The error is small. So this is the average of those two numbers, which is, Nina, you can read it out. Okay, it's that. So then we do the same thing for those birds that arrive from a migration, and they have to do with these classes of territories, and they get that number, which is the average of something and something, and then when we do this, we get that. So everything seems quite easy, except that we don't quite know where these numbers should come from, because how do we know how many birds have survived the winter? Because we need to know how many were produced the previous year. And there's a whole kind of like dynamics underlying this thing. So, but this can be luckily done. So if we assume now that the resident strategy in the population is to migrate with probability X, and again, remember what we mean by resident strategy, it's not staying put. It means whatever is right now being the norm in the population. Then we want to check if a different value of X can lead to better fitness. So here's the reproductive success, what they are achieving. Then they might themselves be surviving the summer. We assume that survival is only applied in the winter, and then we do the bookkeeping of everybody that can exist into the next year. A mutant uses exactly the same equation, but with a different value of X. So this is the X prime here. But then, there's this problem that we don't actually know the values. How high are we in the along the y-axis unless we know the numbers? So then we have to figure out how the dynamics of the situation works. And it works like this. We have in a particular year, we have breeding going on, we get the autumn population size, then we get some survival, and then we get the new numbers the next year. And if we assume that the population is at equilibrium, we can solve these things by setting the state of the population in a previous year to the same as it is in the future year. And when you do this, this is what you have to solve. It's not particularly scary. Everything is kind of linear and nice. So you throw the definitions that we got from the graphs into that, and we solve. And this is then, it looks a bit sort of meh, but numerically, it's totally unproblematic to get the values out of this. And then you get your solutions. The goal then is to predict the evolutionary stable values of X, like what can be used by the population so that another that choice for X would always lead to lower fitness than the current one. So again, this can be done. Fitness of residents and fitness of mutants. And you can see how each of them can yield offspring that do something slightly different from their parents. So because the decision to migrate or not migrate is a probabilistic factor here, so the whole thing kind of like loops back together and can be solved quite nicely. So that was just a sort of interlude about the methods, how to actually derive these graphs. But the graphs are what really allow me to go back to the topic of population fitness, which is what this lecture is all about, because it behaves in ways that is maybe a bit counterintuitive at first sight, but when you think it through, you start understanding it quite well. So here, what I have on the x-axis, and there will be more panels, this is why the label is a bit shifted here. What I have on the x-axis is the proportion of migrants that are currently being used in the population. So it ranges from 0 to 1. And on the top graph here, I have the fitness of migrants or non-migrants. Based on what I had on the previous slides. And what I have here as an assumption is that the survival in the north over winter is 30%, whereas if you migrate, you achieve 50%. And this is quite migration favoring, so that you can see that the migrants are always fitter than the non-migrants, and therefore the proportion of migration goes to 1. And everybody should migrate. But there's frequency dependence in the system. So if I now make the survival in the north a little bit bigger, so you can see that now the curves cross. And this is going to be your equilibrium value that most individuals should migrate. But survival in the north is a bit more permissible. So a few of you might try the non-migrating strategy, and you get the very, very best territories. But if the territory quality starts to be low enough, because very many of you start using that, then it's no longer worth the risk, because there's still quite a bit of a survival difference. But we can increase the ease of surviving in the north further. And this is quite logical that the proportion of migrants drops further. So more and more individuals start staying put until you can get into a situation where survival would be still quite a bit bigger if you migrated, 0.5 compared to 42% if you stay in the north, but nobody should migrate anymore. So everybody's trying. This is like the tree standing up. All this time I've been pointing at the top row here, which is the fitness of the individuals, measured, by the way, as lifetime reproductive success here, because we can do that, or it matches the lifetime reproductive success because the population is stable. But the lower row has been behaving accordingly here. There's something interesting going on here, because we can also plot what is the population size at equilibrium, and in this case measured in the spring before the new individuals have been added to the population. So here we predict that everybody should migrate, and therefore this is the population size. 10,000 individuals can live in this area. But now we make the winters in the north a little bit milder, and you can see that there's a bit more the proportion of migrants drops a little bit, and so does the population size. And here the color also changes because this is kind of like my depiction of that, there's more and more of those blue individuals that choose not to migrate. Until here, nobody migrates. And what has happened to the population is that previously the habitat was able to sustain a population of 10,000, and now it's only like 2/3 roughly of it, or 60%. So as the population adaptively evolves, it actually shrinks. And this is, when the organisms, they start investing more and more into stuff that is beneficial to them when it comes to getting to the best territories. But if you were trying to maximize population fitness, whatever this is, you should say that, this is stupid that you sort of try to outcompete each other temporarily. Why don't you all migrate because it's more safe? And then you just do a lottery when you arrive at the breeding grounds and get the better territories that way. That would maximize group performance. And I don't know if you find this sort of insightful or not. I think it's a really fun example. Because I didn't quite know how long an hour is to present all these other examples, I'm just listing 4 different topics that all have slides in my talk here. And there should be 10 minutes time for questions. So I have something like 10 minutes left. Is that right? Yeah. So I could, one way is I could make you vote, kind of like what story do you want to hear? Or I could just choose myself, because this story is what I would like your feedback on the most. But I'm totally happy to talk over coffee or lunch about any of these others that you're reading here. Maybe I'll just read aloud what's here. So there's actually a sort of empirically grounded story on the Seychelles magpie robin, which used to be the world's one of the most endangered bird species, and with a recovery program they have been increasing. But we took the data and we quantified just how much the population growth has been slowed down because they fight with each other so much. But then there's a story that I will actually tell you. Then with Shanyi Li, we have been interested in why sexual selection causes so many trait differences between males and females. Well, there's a lot of models about that already. But why comparatively rarely do we have the males and females eating different foods and having kind of adaptations that have to do with their kind of naturally selected niche? Even though you would imagine that maybe population growth would be maximized if males and females ate something a bit different, because then there's more food left for the females and they make the babies, and interesting question. And then finally, this is something that also has to do with intra-locus sexual conflict and how different kinds of life cycles determine how that plays out. But given the finite number of minutes that I have left, I'll just go to these slides here about territoriality. Here's some stuff about the robins that I won't show you. But the robins actually lead to that story, because this is one of the islands in the Indian Ocean where they live. And you could imagine that a bird population that is quite productive, and they were quite productive at the time, because they were artificially well fed and all that as part of the conservation program, they might end up saturating the entire island and having, for example, lots of relatively small territories. But for an individual, it might be nice if your own territory would be a bit larger. But then, of course, it means that the total number of breeding pairs that can live on a finite island is going to be smaller. And if they then are very productive because they have these nice large territories, then you end up with a lot of individuals that are called floaters, and they cannot find a breeding position because everywhere is occupied. So we were interested, now I'm not talking about the empirical part of this study, but the theory of space use when selfishly it's a bit nicer if you can guard a larger area. But then for the total population size, this might be negative. So this is from the PhD thesis, and it's also a publication from Andres Lopez Sepulcre, who also worked on the Seychelles magpie robins, but this is a purely theory paper. And this time I'm not going to tell you how the equations work and how to do the analysis. You just have to trust me on the results slide, that the evolving trait here is basically defense effort, like how much you could imagine some sort of pressure do you put towards the boundaries, and how far away from the nest do you have to go before you kind of like give up and some neighbor is doing the same from the other side. So if the defense effort is very low and they are very peaceful towards each other, then you will have lots and lots and lots of very tiny territories. And even though each of them is not so productive, you actually end up with the highest carrying capacity for the island if everybody tries to breed in very small places. Many will fail, but the remaining ones will have relatively high reproductive success. And from a certain point onwards, you will have a net production of floaters, so that the number of breeders falls below the total population size. And the difference, the gap here, these are the birds that exist on the island, but they cannot breed because they can't find a site to squeeze into. And if it's just complete warfare all the time, then you actually end up with a population going extinct. But this is just the population consequences in the model. This is not yet saying what evolves, what is an evolutionary stable defense effort. So do we end up with a world that looks a bit more like this, or do we end up with a world that will look a bit like that when we let the thing evolve? And here I've just sort of drawn the gap as well. So this is the same distance as that. So you will have a population of floaters if the defense effort is moderate. And to our astonishment, we could show that regardless of what we assume about the territory qualities distribution, you will end up with selection favoring smaller defense efforts if you're too high, lower ones if you're too low, and it always matched the maximization of the non-breeding part of the population. And that was quite remarkable. So we wrote this and we sort of showed nice integrals and equations, and we were happy with this. And then some very smart Dutch people said that we're going to write a response to this because we don't think this generalizes. For example, they said that, well, okay, they were inspired by a tropical bird, which is aseasonal, that's fine. But if we move to the, Netherlands, then things are seasonal. And then they had an alternative version of this model and nothing particular was maximized there. But then we wrote a rebuttal saying that in their model also something is maximized. They just didn't notice that if you look at the population size just before the competitive bottleneck, which is the spring, then again, that gets maximized in their model as well. And ever since I've been quite interested in this, and I'll sort of make this my final slide, because if you read, there's some old texts by Charlesworth, for example, that under certain kinds of density-dependent competition, what is maximized is the stage, the number of individuals in the stage where the competition is then applied. And this seems to be very well aligned with that kind of thing. But then on the other hand, well, I promised to make this my last slide, but I'll just add one more, where sometimes populations have males and females, and we know that males can be harmful to females. And does anything get maximized? When does population size get maximized? When there's density regulation and there's males and females and internal conflicts and all those kind of things. So this is something that I would love to talk to you guys. And because I want to leave quite a bit of time for questions, I think I'll just sort of skip all the other alternatives that I would have been happy to talk about, and then I stupidly got out of the, because I somewhat plannedly, I didn't manage to talk about everybody's work here, but they have all been fantastic work. And also there's more members in the lab whose work I didn't even over ambitiously try to fit into this talk. And also I still have some money. So if you want to do a postdoc with me, talk to me. Many of you are a bit on the old side for that, but maybe there's some. So thank you.
It's like I call it sabbatical.
Could you give us some intuition for why selection maximizes the number of floaters?
I mean, this is, I would sort of like to write my next grant about this, like what does selection maximize in terms of numbers of individuals, not in terms of growth rates, and when. But like don't quote me on this because I might be wrong here, but it's sort of, there's some sort of a bottleneck, and imagine that you have to buy lottery tickets to get through that bottleneck. And the more, it's really important in life to maximize that number, because otherwise you just don't manage. It's a bit like, I've got some sperm competition analogies in here, but why exactly it should matter only there and nothing else gets maximized at all. Yes, you can see it's just ... at the end of the sentence. So, but something to do with with what I just said. But if you, I'd be totally happy to buy 2 beers to somebody who gives me a better analogy there. Yeah.
You said something, and I feel like my brain wasn't going fast enough. You said that one of the possibilities for why you were seeing the effect of selection at the end there had to do with sort of age-structured selection and work Charles Worth did, and looking at where selection acts on the stage or age where that is most impacted.
Yeah.
Could you explain it again? I didn't get that.
That's maybe the same question as the last
Maybe
question,
it's the same
isn't it? Yeah. And this is really the one that, precisely the reason why of all those 4 examples that I could have told you about, I understand very well what's happening kind of like, in that model mathematically. Biologically, to put it in words, I think I could just only repeat what I said already 2 minutes ago, that if you have, instead of a bottleneck, what would be a good analogy? There were buckets in some talk. So if there's some sort of a bucket, and at some point you know that it's going to be overflowing and full because everybody's putting their lottery tickets into it, then there's just, like, would I even believe in this from sort of first principles, or do I only believe in this because post hoc, because the equations work that way? That you really have to arrange all your life in such a way that the most stringent competitive setting is the one where you have the highest number of lottery tickets, and maybe that is kind of like nailing it better than anything else, and all else is kind of like going towards that squeeze, which is the final competition, and it can be at any stage of the life cycle. It doesn't have to be like it was in the spring in the seasonal bird population, but it might be some other stage in some other settings. I think there's some published papers where, like, fish populations, and maybe this explains a bit better my jumbled question to one of the earlier talks, that if the juveniles kind of like live in a particular habitat and very few fish get out of that, and if you add more to that, then it's still only the same number that goes through. So you really have to sort of put your juvenile fish into that. Whereas if they compete with adults as well, then the competition sort of spreads more widely. And
it's the transition from being a floater into being a breeder that is the critical point here. So I need to be represented in that floater population
precisely
as high as I can.
Yeah.
Because otherwise I am out of luck.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, notice that we made some other simplifying assumptions here, that all floaters have an equal chance and they can keep floating until they're dead, and they don't sort of, it's that, every model needs to assume something. But I'm still, that particular model that was published like 20 years ago, and I'm still sort of occasionally fascinated by it and kind of would like to work on more on these kind of things.
Thanks. That was really nice. I've a question disguised as a comment, or vice versa. I can't tell which. I thought it was quite nice. You thought a lot about how if individual fitness creeps up, how the phase diagram changes and whatnot. But I think a question that I'm sure you've also thought about, but maybe it's worth just chatting to the group, is especially nowadays, maybe the environment is changing a whole lot too, even in the face of constant fitness. I just wonder if you'd chat about how maybe those phase diagrams would change in the setting of what we're looking at, which is rapidly changing environmental conditions, maybe outstripping. And then the second part that I wish you'd add in is that it's maybe, that the time scales of environmental change are changing more quickly than evolution's used to trying to keep up with. And so that evolutionary rescue usually bails us out. But I'm wondering if, if there's some sort of timescale separation that's going to get us in a lot of trouble soon if the environment changes more quickly than we can have, the salt keeps going in faster than we can mutate, but with the birds instead.
The slide is now too far away in there because I'm kicked out of Zoom if I do that carelessly. But if you remember the sort of many columns of the different harshness of winters that I had in there, you could actually make a climate change interpretation there, because climate change is acting more strongly on the climate in the north than in sort of more tropical areas. So therefore, you could argue that what was going on from left to right is actually a climate change shift. But the interesting thing there is that then I was assuming, so it was not really a climate change model in the sense that I wasn't asking anything about the speed of adaptation or the rate at which they managed to achieve this. And it was a case where if they were not adapting, they would actually be at higher population size at the end, which is very
not adapting.
Because adaptation was the cause of the declining population, because they were both realizing that, oh, I can actually survive with a relatively high likelihood even if I stay up north. And if that was not favored genetically because of whatever, lacking genetic variation or something like that, they would actually maintain their population sizes higher. And I have another paper on, I didn't put that in here, but also on bird migration, where you can make a similar argument in those species that are 100% migrants, but the arrival timing is under selection. There, it's often the case that the same principle, kind of like you have to arrive early to come to the best territories, and maybe suboptimally early, because you just want to outcompete your neighbor arriving there. And if everybody could just sort of relax and not arrive so stupidly early, then you would still get the same sequence of territories, but with kind of better weather. And there, it's very funny. In that model, what happens is that if climate change proceeds rapidly and you haven't quite adapted to your new surroundings, then it can even be that the immediate effect of climate change is a drop in population size, because you're now breeding at a maladaptive time. But the drop in population size actually selects for a relaxation of the competitive effect. And because you don't have to worry so much about being ahead of your neighbors because there's not so many neighbors. And that can mean that precisely when the population should adapt to arrive earlier, because you have to breed earlier, because the caterpillars come earlier, then because of the lacking neighbor effect, you actually don't experience as strong selection as you did before climate change. So this was a lot of sentences in one go, and I should have had it as a slide. But as a net effect, you can actually relax selection when you would need stronger selection to cope with climate change, which is a super counterintuitive result. I don't know if any empiricists has ever been able to show this, because it's a bit of a hard thing to show why exactly they are not adapting, but theoretically it's possible.
Cheers, thank you.